You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Anthony Flint of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy to talk about his book, Mayor's Desk, 20 Conversations with Local Leaders Solving Global Problems. We chat about the future of cities through the eyes of a mayor and the challenges that connect cities around the world. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, amazing Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city wizards and transportation experts, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. We've also got some bonus material up there, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight net bike scarf is back in stock. I'm also going to make a concerted effort to make some new designs, but if you want to get one of the Buster Bike scarves or the Lightweight Bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can buy books at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarcholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. A quick note for Patreon supporters. I've set up an ad-free podcast RSS feed at Patreon. This means if you want to listen to the show without ads or promotional episodes in your podcatcher of choice, you can do so by heading over to your Patreon account and getting the feed there. I'll post instructions in the show notes of how to do it. And if you aren't a Patreon supporter, you can do so by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Even just $1 a month gets you our podcast free of outside ads. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Anthony Flint, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
It's great to be here.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I've been a journalist all my career, primarily at the Boston Globe, where I became more and more interested in architecture, urban design, urban planning, and real estate development. And then after a brief stint in state government, I came to the Lincoln Institute in 2006. And I've been here ever since. We're a global think tank looking at the role of land use and land policy in society, broadly speaking, in subjects like housing and climate and local public finance. And so I write for Landlines Magazine, which is our magazine, online and in print. I'm also host of the Land Matters podcast at the Lincoln Institute, and I also organize, we've been trying to do it every year, a journalist workshop to get everyone in the media who's interested in these subjects to meet with expert sources and look at resources and otherwise get sort of up to speed on the current policy conversations. So I guess you could say I'm sort of an in-house journalist at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and having a great time.
I love those forums, and the reason why is because I get to meet all the like-minded folks that are writing stuff around the country about these issues, and it's so fun to have been to a couple of these and just have a chat and sit down and have a chocolate chip cookie with somebody, you know, that I've seen their byline on print and finally get to connect with them. And then also a number of them are actually subscribers to the newsletter too, which really makes me happy too, to see folks and get their reactions to like what we're posting. So I really do appreciate that. It's been really fun to go to those and see what everybody's talking about. And also like the experts you bring in and from different places, mayors and administrators and stuff. It's just a really excellent way to like learn new things about what's happening in cities.
Well, that's great. We're hoping to do it again, possibly in December later this year.
You also mentioned Lincoln as a place for global policy, and I think that's really interesting too. I think you were in Cairo recently. So, you know, just going places to talk about these issues from an English-speaking perspective.
Yeah, it's been a privilege. I was in Cairo for the World Urban Forum, which, of course, as you know, is something put on by the UN Habitat. And our work in Latin America and South America, you know, has brought me to Bogota and Medellin. And there's just no substitute for getting out in the field, as it were, and seeing how all of these themes play out of, broadly speaking, human settlement. And in Cairo, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, I actually had the chance to interview the equivalent of the mayor of Cairo. They call him the governor. And so it's been a great opportunity to go all over the world and have a global perspective.
What do you think you learn when you go to these places? I mean, obviously it's very different from, what mayors do in the United States, but it's interesting to think about, all these issues that pop up that are somewhat similar.
Yeah, well, obviously in the global south, there are big differences, but there's also some commonalities, sometimes sadly. I guess the one thing that is truly global is the challenges presented by climate change and building resilience and disasters, where the fires in LA were not so much different from flooding or other climate-related events elsewhere around the world. And even if you think about homeless encampments and informal settlement, it's of the same thread. So it's always good to get out of the United States and appreciate what other communities and different places are experiencing. And I hope to do more of that. COVID took us all out of the running for a couple of years, but now we're back traveling around.
I want to go back further before we talk about the book, because I have lots of questions about it. But I do want to ask how you got interested in cities. Like, what was the first inclination that you had that it was something that you cared about or were interested in going back, maybe even as far as childhood?
Well, I've always enjoyed walking around cities and have been impressed by what I now believe is the greatest form of civilization that we can all aspire to. I know that sounds very grand, but I really do believe that cities are beneficial in so many ways. I agree with Ed Glazer. They are hubs of innovation. They are per capita the greenest form of settlement in terms of efficiency and the use of energy and transit and density. But they're also incredibly beautiful places. I have been, in their swoon since being a young man. As I moved into journalism, I worked my way up to the Globe at smaller newspapers throughout New England, and things like land use and housing and zoning, were so central to those early days. I sort of picked up on the idea that, this is pretty important. And that continued at the Boston Globe as I became interested in architecture and urban design. And this was a period in the 90s where Boston was going through a lot of changes and gearing up and doing a lot of planning for the Seaport District, for example, a maritime industrial area that has now been redeveloped. But back then there was a lot of planning going on for that. The Big Dig, which I ended up covering, a giant engineering project, but also intertwined with the life of the city of Boston. And so I got a little break and did the Loeb Fellowship at Harvard Design School in 2000, 2001. And I kind of got trained up and more familiar with all of these subjects. And that was a real turning point. Came back to the Globe after the Loeb Fellowship and continued to write about land use and housing, but sort of had a little bit of a more global perspective. The more and more I got into this, just the more and more captivated I ended up being.
That's awesome. I love asking the question because I feel like there's so many ways that people come into loving cities, or at least, being interested in them. And everybody's story is different. And I want to encourage younger folks who are interested in this subject matter that, there's all these different ways to get in. You don't have to have a planning degree. You can just come from any number of sources and places, and everybody's welcome, I feel like, in planning. I've been wanting to chat with you about this book for a while, and I'm glad we're finally getting to do that. What do you think is so important to talk with mayors about cities?
Well, at the Lincoln Institute, we have long been interested in and supportive of local government. I think that's where the action is right now in 2025. I think there's going to be much more of a spotlight on local and state policy action. Local leaders paying attention to what's important to their constituents and their quality of life. So I think the local level really is deserving of a lot of attention. And so we decided to start this series called Mayor's Desk, which was a series of interviews with local leaders from around the world. We ran them in Landlines magazine. And then when we had 20 of them, we compiled them in the book, Mayor's Desk, 20 Conversations with Local Leaders Solving Global Problems. That's published in partnership with Columbia University Press. That came out last year. And I've since been interviewing more and more mayors, so we might get to another 20, and who knows, we might do another edition of Mayor's Desk. When you put them all together, it really is a pretty impressive compilation of, I think for the most part, genuine, innovative people trying to address problems at the local level. And we think local leaders are people that we should pay more attention to.
One of the themes that I saw in the interviews was how mayors deal with like the differences in like tax bases, how some deal with decline of cities versus the places that are growing in the Sun Belt, et cetera. What's your sense of the difference between mayors in these growing cities versus some shrinking cities, as you've had kind of a mixture of both?
Yeah, part of the process, which I give all credit to my colleagues Maureen Clark and Catherine Roth, is figuring out, well, who should we interview and where should we go? Part of our work program here at the Lincoln Institute is all about, we call them legacy cities. Mm-hmm. So those are the post-industrial shrinking cities that you refer to. And that was a good place to start. One of the first places we went to was Syracuse, and a terrific interview with the mayor there. These legacy cities are grappling with particular challenges having to do with the loss of population, the loss of manufacturing, how to sort of reinvent themselves. And so that's been a common theme. In some places, like Cincinnati, I would argue, they're dealing with a little bit of both. They're coming out of a decline, arguably. So my interview with Aftab Purval, fantastic guy, mayor of Cincinnati, they're thinking about, well, we seem to be kind of in a position where ultimately we might be viewed as a bit of a climate haven. And so they've had to worry about affordability and housing supply. So in some ways, these post-industrial cities are kind of joining the fray of the San Franciscos and the Bostons and the Seattles of the world in struggling with affordability primarily. So many differences, but that is a common theme, affordable housing.
I wrote this note to myself. Many cities are stuck digging themselves out from their past lives and the confines of their borders. There's in the book post-industrial, post-communism, and even post-national. But my question is like pre what? We're post everything, but what are we doing in the future?
Well, I think that's what all of these leaders are really wrestling with is, what's the future of cities? They're responsible for, in some cases, whether it's Delhi or Seoul or other places like that, it just huge populations with really pressing day-to-day challenges of keeping people safe and providing safe and sustainable housing. And so I think right down the line of the spectrum of the cities where we have gone and interviewed these mayors, they are all trying to figure out the most sustainable future they can possibly have. A future that's equitable and safe from hazard. Also to build on this tradition of being hubs of innovation. I mean, there's a lot of big things that all of these cities are wrestling with and that the mayors are confronting and trying to plan for, all the while governing day to day and dealing with, a wide variety of day-to-day emergencies and pressing challenges. So it's pretty impressive that anybody would even want to take that on, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder what the psychology is. I mean, a lot of the mayors that you talk to, are most of them dreamers or pragmatic, or do they follow a certain line, or are they all over the place based on kind of where their city is on the timeline?
Yeah, I think in some cases there's just been a happy coincidence of interesting leaders coming into a city at a particular point in time. Again, I would point to Aftab Purval in Cincinnati, but also Mira Weinstein in Burlington, Claudia Lopez in Bogota. If there's any kind of common theme, I guess I would say that these folks are ambitious, but a little bit more of policy wonks and not so much. I mean, many of them are very articulate and it's fantastic, but they're not polished. They're certainly not bombastic. They are pretty practical and pragmatic and a little bit more focused on the nuts and bolts, but kind of in a cool way, whether it's zoning or building codes, they're figuring out the machinery that, ultimately really, really makes a difference. You might even say a little nerdy sometimes, but across the board, genuine and thoughtful leaders, which is really nice to see. I mean, I try to keep arm's length in terms of being a journalist, but, I can't help but think after talking with some of these folks that, wow, this is nice and even a little bit inspiring to see leaders like that. Now, as I point out in some of the pieces I've done looking back at this work, there's definitely political ambitions for some of these leaders. Marty Walsh went on to be labor secretary. The mayor of Oakland, Libby Schaaf, is running for state treasurer in California. The mayor of Bogota, I mentioned Claudia Lopez, is a very credible candidate for president of Colombia. Same with the mayor of Athens. Many of these leaders may ultimately have their eye to sort of practice their craft at a higher level, and that's okay. Some are more sort of urban mechanics in the style of Tom Menino, who's mayor of Boston for many years, who didn't have those higher political aspirations. So it's a mix.
I feel like mayors would make great leaders in the higher echelons of politics and governing. And I often wonder if sometimes we're stuck where we are because they can't get there because of their maybe down-to-earthness, or there's no like big personality quality that sticks out for them that makes people do the whole beer test thing with them, right? Like here in California, we have folks like Scott Wiener who do an amazing job at legislating, at coming together with folks to think about big ideas and how to legislate that and put that into law. But you don't see the possibility for them to be like the president of the United States because it's just like they're in the weeds and they're in the world they're looking at. It doesn't seem to like translate to this larger cult of personality that's kind of taken over the larger discussion about who should lead a country. And maybe, in my opinion anyways, the person who is less of a cult of personality maybe should be the one. I mean, we're looking at Canada right now with the new prime minister and the potential new leader after the election, Mark Carney, and I'm seeing a person who is more along the lines of like those operators who understand the details, who maybe are better fit for the job than somebody who maybe would brush off a lot of the issues that people care about.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a little bit of both, urban mechanic and quite polished and articulate. I'm thinking of Pete Buttigieg.
Yeah.
In the current, running or consideration of how you get a mayor to run for governor or senate or president. Exactly 3 mayors have become U.S. presidents, Andrew Johnson, Grover Cleveland, and Calvin Coolidge. Nobody more recent. Plenty of mayors have thought about it. You go back to someone like Mayor Lindsay in New York City, where, it's wonderful fodder for, sort of chatter about or speculate about what their political fortunes might be. But I think there's several components that would make the experience of being a mayor quite applicable to running bigger systems. And in fact, I mean, running a city is in some ways comparable to running a federal government. So it's good training, and we'll have to see, what happens. But for these purposes, in terms of the book Mayor's Desk, looking at these folks, I'd keep an eye on people like Aftab Purvel, Randall Woodfin from Birmingham, Alabama. Again, I mentioned the mayors from Bogota and Athens. So keep an eye on Greece and Colombia to see if a former mayor becomes president.
I was impressed by Marvin Reese's take on immigration in the book, and his comment, the powerful have put the poor against each other for too long, and reframing the discussion kind of away from the national perspective to that local one that we were just talking about, thinking about. What did you take from that discussion with him? Mayor of, I think it was Bristol, UK.
Bristol, England, yes. Marvin Rees. He was an interesting case because what ended up happening was that there was a vote and they phased out the specific role of mayor sort of just as he was a real rising star. But he talked about the sort of post-national landscape where he was feeling, I think, buffeted by national politics and was thinking that these issues are all too important. We've got to get to work at the city level. And he predicted a sort of a post-national environment where bottom-up innovation will flourish. And he said, we can't leave our futures in the hands of national governments. Cities are equipped with the political machinery to lead the way. So I think there's some truth in that. I think he was feeling frustrated, as many mayors maybe are today in 2025. I think we saw a good representation or just kind of standing up for principles, however you view the immigration debate, when we saw the mayor of Denver, Mike Johnston, and the mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu, testify in Congress about immigration in those cities. And of course, everybody realizes how important immigration is for the economic life of cities, for building housing for that matter, and the importance of welcoming immigrants while being mindful of any criminal activity, as has been alleged. So on things like that, it seems like it's ended up being a kind of a built-in conflict between federal policies and these values and principles that we've seen articulated in cities.
I mean, that's a theme about belonging too. I mean, thinking about, international mayors trying to understand how people of different backgrounds can coexist in their cities. I mean, you talk about the mayor of Athens and some of the things that they were talking about. Most of the mayors have to kind of understand and deal with, how people come to their cities and what they have to deal with when they get there. And then also you were talking about the mayor of Cincinnati and his thinking about, why are big companies coming in to buy houses and making them more expensive? And what does that mean for the populations that want to live here? Immigration doesn't necessarily have to be cross-border. It could be between cities as well. We just talked with Yoni Applebaum about his book, Stuck. And so thinking about those movements as well between cities, not just between countries. And you start thinking more about belonging for everybody, not just the folks who are there already.
Yeah, it's a lot to manage, and it's so dynamic, and the economic conditions can be quite fragile in day to day, while all the while hoping to create places that are, welcoming and where people can work their way up and take advantage of economic opportunity.
It's also interesting reading the book and thinking about the pandemic, how much things have changed since like the start of the pandemic. You did a number of these interviews in 2020, and it's almost kind of sad to see like the optimism that was there at the time about transportation policy. You talked to Libby Schaff and thinking about what they did with streets in Oakland and where we're at now with that, and almost somewhat a reversal we see in New York City, where they haven't brought back as many of the dining parklets because city regulations, because some of the folks wanted to keep parking there. And so they're only available in the summertime instead of all year round, and a lot of them have disappeared. So looking back at your interviews during the pandemic and some of the optimism that existed even in a tough time, and looking at things the way they are now, how do you feel about that juxtaposition?
Yeah, well, I think at the time, I was interviewing Libby Schaff in Oakland. You remember the cruise ship that, had to be evacuated. And this was really a period of time where cities were forced to respond quickly and capably. And I think that's one of the silver linings that came out of that, was this just sort of generally speaking, ability to act faster and to say that, well, I don't care that we have never bumped out a cafe into parking spaces. We're just going to do it and see what happens. So I think a little bit of that is carried on since the pandemic. But you're right. Other things to come out of the pandemic in terms of complete streets and pedestrian walkways and bike and bus lanes. Now, I think that momentum, the complete streets momentum, has carried on pretty strongly. But, and I'm okay with this, you see a little bit of an adjustment in Boston, for example. Michelle Wu who I hope to interview, she's up for re-election later this year, has taken the feedback about bike and bus lanes and that transformation that's going on in Boston and ultimately listening to her constituents. I just interviewed the mayor of Providence, Brett Smiley, who is slightly less enthusiastic about bike and bus lanes and dedicated bike lanes and so forth. And, he makes the point like, yes, of course I want this, but I got to do some balancing here. And, at the end of the day, on a good day, like under 10% of people in the city of Providence are going to be commuting by bicycle or using bikes. So, he's making those kinds of calculations. I'm sort of okay with that, even if it's sort of a slowing down of that process, as you point out, that arguably began in the pandemic. But overall, I'm mostly impressed with how cities responded. I think you still see lots of manifestations of the things that we experimented with that carry on to this day. And it's making the public realm better overall.
I would love to chat with the mayor of Providence and set him straight from my perspective. There was an article that I posted this week from WGBH, your public station in Boston, and there was a professor who's at Northeastern, and he goes back and forth between Tokyo. And I found that interesting, the autocentricity of it all and how pairing those two cities against each other, Boston and Tokyo, and what's the difference? And his conclusion was that we put autos above everything else. And so I personally feel like we're ceding too much space or too much feeling to the automobile. But it's interesting to hear from these mayors, and they get yelled at a lot, right? Yeah. And I'm sure that, like you said, the Providence mayor, he is a little not sour on it, but it's just like it's something he probably hears about. It's like those folks here in San Francisco who work on certain streets, they own businesses on certain streets, and all they hear all day are the people that come in and complain about parking. That's one person and they're complaining, but nobody that goes in there riding a bike or walking says, hey, I came in here, I couldn't have a sidewalk or I couldn't park my bike. So they don't hear from those folks. And so I think it's partially, on us to kind of let merchants know and stuff like that, we are coming by bike and walking, but also they hear it all day. And so that might be one of the calculations. And with Mayor Wu as well. I mean, I think I've seen on Streets Blog Massachusetts how people are disappointed in some of the recalculations. But if they're voters and the folks that are, making the most noise, I know the squeaky wheel is not the one we mostly want to listen to, but if it's the one you hear, you just kind of want to turn it off, right?
Right. Yeah. And, I don't want to say it's an awkward transition, but it is a transition. And I think these efforts are to be encouraged to sort of get everybody more used to the setup of the public realm that is shared space so that it's just like the new normal and not anything quite so unusual or funky or, like, what is this? There used to be parking spaces here, freaking out about it. I think it's a matter of transition and getting used to a different kind of configuration for urban streets. Of course, look at a place like Paris. Now, that is one interview that I have yet to do, but I hope to do someday. You see them getting way out front on the space that, as you say, is dedicated to cars.
Yeah. That's another thing about the book, too, is that you talk to folks, obviously, from other countries outside the United States. And it's interesting to see how the transportation policy discussions go there, too. I mean, you have Athens and Bogota and places around the world that are looking at these things differently because their constituents are looking at these things differently. And so whether you have a cable car instead of talking about bike lanes, it might be a different world in terms of thinking about the transportation policy that comes from other places.
Yeah, I mean, transportation is destiny for cities, and it's been amazing to see whether it's London and Crossrail or right here in the U.S. I was just out in Denver for the American Planning Association conference and talked with the mayor of Denver, Mike Johnston, and the light rail network that has been established in that otherwise very spread out Western city is really incredible to see and to see it being used. And it's just become, arguably, like bike lanes, it's just become part of the urban landscape. And of course, there was the environmental mandate for all of this. But there's also, even if you put that aside, here in 2025, it's just the convenience and the quality of life that these transit systems kind of enable But yes, yeah, it's been fascinating to look at the different places. In Bogota, you mentioned the cable cars and also escalators, an intervention that almost instantly improves the quality of life, even if you can't do much about other things. And of course, there's poverty and violence, but just the idea that someone in Bogota or Medellin could cut their commute down to a reasonable amount of time if they have a job downtown by taking these cable cars or escalators. There's other ideas for people movers and other places. I applaud any of those kinds of new approaches and innovations in urban mobility, to use the grand phrase, but that's really what it's about. It's just such an important part of any city's life.
The escalator thing is really interesting. I mean, I feel like if you looked at those spaces, and most of us would not think like, oh, well, they just need an escalator. Like that's not something it's almost something out of place, out of time. Then you put it in there and it makes so much sense. And you're like, why didn't we think about this before? And sometimes you kind of have to think a little bit outside the box, I think, in some of these instances. And even in the US, we can possibly think outside the box. We're so car focused that, sometimes maybe we need to, kind of step back a bit and think about, the future. And we talked about the post-industrial, post-national, post-everything, pre-what. And I think some of that pre-what is just kind of dreaming about some big stuff that we might be able to do and not like making it into something like the Hyperloop became, which is like a way to push back on high-speed rail or a way to be negative about transportation, but a future that everybody can imagine that is positive and has positive externalities in the future, I think would be a good way to go.
And of course, in so many of these cities, looking to a future where electric vehicles are more commonplace, scooters, electric bikes, just all manner of ways to get around that will be different from the combustion engine and, the Buick that needs to back into that parking space in South Boston.
Going back to the pandemic a little bit, I also appreciated what some of these mayors said about, the cities dragging their feet over time. And, some of the stuff that should have been done way ahead of time got accelerated because of the pandemic, but maybe it should have been done earlier, like internet connection for low-income families and things like that. Things that are the public good, but we just hadn't prioritized them before. And so I think that's an interesting way that some of these mayors are looking at things too, is like the pandemic forced them to rethink what's important. What are we providing to people that might help them in the long run?
Yeah, and I think there's a little bit of a theme of urgency and being nimble. I'll tell you the one thing that has stuck in my mind is Yvonne Aki Sawyer, the mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone. She appointed Africa's first chief heat officer and did one thing that I don't know why I'm still so impressed by this, but it just seemed like it was a intervention that didn't take a lot of time. It didn't take a study. They just made it happen. They worked in collaboration with the Arch Rockefeller Foundation. And that was to put shades over the open air markets in the city. Primarily women, almost entirely women, would go a long way and they would come and they would just suffer in the heat. And they developed a fabric that was pretty easy to manufacture and design and set up so that you just have these cooling shades over the open air marketplaces. Now, is that going to solve climate change or, are there going to be other sort of extreme heat incidents that continue to make life miserable? But for that one slice of life in Freetown, there was no fussing around. It was just like, this is a good idea. We're going to do this. And these shades were installed. It sounds really simple, but, I think that's the kind of nimble activity that has become, more and more important.
Another thing that I was really impressed by was a mayor that you'd mentioned already, Miro Weinberger. And I've been thinking about this a lot too, is the idea of public utilities and public goods and the public side of things, and thinking about a publicly owned utility, a public power company that can actually, transform your city. And so Burlington seems like it's on its way to the future, where other cities may be kind of lagging behind. And part of that is just because they have ownership of a public utility and they have people inside of the public utility that see the benefits that they can bring to people.
Yeah, Burlington, Vermont is a great case study in getting to net zero, as it sounds almost quaint today, doesn't it? That this would be a goal for anyone, but the package of initiatives in Burlington are impressive and focused. and the policy goals are really achievable. Now, they do have this municipal electrical utility that does seem to be kind of unique, but part of what the book suggests, or we hope, and we even added a bunch of what we called replicable strategies, was to take something like that and see, well, where is this possible in another city? Take what, steal our ideas to take what's going on in one city and see if it can't be applied to another. So it's really been kind of a study in innovation in that way. And I think, other people have picked up on this, namely Bloomberg and their mayor's center now at the Harvard Kennedy School. That's what it's all about, is exchanging these ideas and strategies for anyone to use, and particularly, new mayors coming in, getting an education on, what has been tried, what's the context, and just talking with other mayors about their experience. Well, what's it like to have your own municipal utility that you can make as green as it can be? So there's a lot, I sense there's a lot of ferment. And one of the things I've imagined, and in fact, we've done this where we've done a mayor's panel at the American Planning Association. So you get some of these mayors together, and it's really fun.
That's my dream here in San Francisco, is taking back the PG&E and infrastructure, making our own public utility. And then, if we have all these electric vehicles and stuff, one of the things that, Miro said in the book is quoted, every time we bring another electric vehicle or heat pump online, that's revenue for the city. And so my dream was to, set up the public utility in San Francisco, which there's been discussions about. And, if people are going to park on the street, give them electric chargers from the city utility, and then use that money that they would generate that would go to a profit center for an oil company otherwise, and use that to fund your transit system, or use that to fund some other public good that the city needs. Use it to fund the development of solar panels or heat pumps or whatever it may be that will reduce the weight of need in your city. And so I've had this dream before, and so I loved seeing it actually happen in another place. And, to know that it's possible is always a good, push forward.
Right, exactly. To see how it can play out. And of course, every city's different, but yeah, the power of example.
What do you think this book would have been outside the pandemic?
That's a good question. It's almost kind of hard to imagine, which kind of applies to all of life, right? You can't imagine.
You never know what's going on, yeah.
What it was like without the pandemic, right? I just can't do it. But I think it was an episode that tested municipal government, certainly the federal government in all kinds of ways, but at the local level, in a weird way, it kind of reinvigorated the relationship I think people had with their local government in some ways. And so I think we're going to be studying this for years to come, right? The effect on the pandemic on all of our lives, and for cities in particular. So yeah, that's a good question. I don't think it would be as rich or as interesting without the pandemic, as sort of macabre as that may sound. But like I said, a pandemic changed all of us in ways that we're going to be reflecting on, I think, for a long while.
I find it fascinating to see how much the infusion of money from things like the American Rescue Plan or the IRA or the IIJA, the infrastructure bill, have had on what cities can do or what they feel like they can do. Usually budget crunches abound throughout cities in the United States, but there was this moment in time when there was extra money, and so you could do experiments that maybe you couldn't try before. And so what did we learn from those? Is there any indication that from your discussions that was just kind of like a bounty that benefited places around the country?
Well, I think it ended up manifesting in plenty of positive things, and certainly in the physical or public realm. But I think what we're facing now is cities dealing with the fact that party is over, right?
Mm-hmm.
That funding is no longer there. And then, of course, you've got this very typical municipal finance squeeze between revenues and expenditures for services, let alone any capital projects and infrastructure. So I think what's going to be interesting now is sort of the pandemic hangover, if you will, where municipalities are, right back in that squeeze. And some of the mayors have dealt with this, and of course, I think are going to be dealing with this, and that is, in terms of local public finance, the reliance on the property tax, which is a good tax overall and a very democratic tax, but I think there's going to be increasing sort of revolts and backlash against the property tax just at the moment when cities and towns are going to be relying on it, as they have been, more than ever. So I think their challenge is going to be fending off some bad ideas, some sort of Proposition 13 style ideas or caps or limits, or even, as the governor of Florida has suggested, eliminating it altogether. It's the primary source of revenue for cities and towns, and I think it's going to be post-COVID and post this federal funding, you're going to see a lot more of that, I think, in the months ahead.
You talk about that with the mayor of Cleveland, the disparities in the land they sit on. I thought that was an interesting quote. Thinking about those property taxes and the Georgism of it all is fascinating. I'm frustrated, I think, by this discussion about property tax and just like the common good and the getting away from, what is a common good? What is the Commonwealth for the common good, putting together resources to build things, whether that's infrastructure or housing or whatever it may be. And so the tax discussion, and there was an article, I think yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, talking about this specifically, like people are, they're suffering because their housing values are going up, but they don't realize those gains, but they still have to pay taxes on it. And so, there's a frustration there, but there's also, a frustration of, here in California, for example, Prop 13, where, houses next to each other, one may pay $2,000 in tax and the other one may pay $24,000, and they're the same street. And there's a lot of disparity there too for longtime livers and folks who just got there. And so there's a lot of issues to be discussed and hashed out. You've interviewed a lot of people, a lot of mayors, and obviously at the Globe you did a lot of stuff. I'm interested in this more kind of shop question, which is like, have you had an interview or a conversation that went a little sideways?
Well, knock on wood, not so far. And I would say, it's mostly on me. I've got to be prepared. I've got to learn about the city, whether it's Warsaw or Bristol, England, or Delhi or Seoul, or a legacy city like Birmingham or Syracuse. I try to immerse myself and get good background on both the local politics and, what the top issues have been. I think the value of Mayor's Desk in a way is that it's within, the guardrails are kind of clear, and happily, these are the issues that at the Lincoln Institute we occupy ourselves with. But talking about housing, transportation, we got into it a little bit in COVID in terms of public health, but it always kind of goes back to the physical realm and, the policies that are in place: zoning, housing, affordability, transportation, bike lanes. There's a category of subjects here which all of the mayors that, we've scheduled interviews with, they definitely meet us more than halfway. So they're like interested in all this stuff. Now, I don't often ask about education, for example. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a bucket of these issues that it's clear from the outset that we're going to be talking about. And most of them just love talking about, things like zoning or, local public finance innovations, land-based financing, anything like that. So it's never gone entirely sideways. And I think it's owing to those two things, a sort of a defined set of issues, where we can really dig into these things and have great conversations.
I do want to ask you a question about the topics generally in the book. And, one of the questions I ask a lot of folks who've written books is there's a lot of work that goes into the book. There's a lot of background that goes into it. You did a lot of research for all these interviews. And then sometimes we feel like there's maybe a subject that we think that people overlook or they don't pay as much of attention to, even though we think it might be important. So is there something that's in the book or something that you've talked with mayors recently that you feel is kind of overlooked or isn't discussed as much as maybe you think it should be?
I don't know. It's just like this has all become pretty iterative. Like it just keeps building on itself. And so in the book, in fact, our editors here, Catherine Roth and Jennifer Sigler, they added little updates and annotations, which I think are really neat, because some of the interviews ran in the magazine a couple of years prior. And so there are these updates. And then there is the section of replicable strategies at the end that collect all of the, innovations, whether it's in Athens or Freetown or wherever it is. And so that, I think, opens the door to continuing to think about, just a wide range of proposed solutions and addressing these various problems. So I guess I look at it as more open-ended, that, nothing has been neglected. I don't think, these folks have their shoulder to the wheel on day-to-day stuff that makes a difference in people's lives, like housing and the nuts and bolts stuff that's kind of underneath all of that, like zoning. And so I can't complain that there's something that hasn't been talked about, right? In sort of in my world, in our world of mechanics of what makes a city tick. And what we've been able to do with the book is sort of an attempt to, keep the conversation going. I guess my answer is no. I don't think there's anything that's been, sort of obviously undercovered or unaddressed. But, I'm in a bit of a bubble looking at some of these subjects where, I'm sort of delighted that anybody's even thinking or talking about it in the first place, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure people could find a bunch of things, but I feel like, this is a pretty good collection of solutions and thoughts and ideas.
Nice. Well, the book is Mayor's Desk, 20 Conversations with Local Leaders Solving Global Problems. It's densely packed with good information, but it doesn't take you too long to get through it. And I think people with time crunches might appreciate that a lot.
And there's a nice foreword by Michael Bloomberg. To put some things in context, he has a lot of respect for the office of mayor, and I think he has a pretty good argument for it. And yes, you can flip through this and, you can pick and choose your mayors. You can choose your own adventure, or you can read them all. Even if you did that back to back, wouldn't take too much time. And that was really the idea behind this. A lot of our publications are about, pretty meaty issues like financing infrastructure and property tax systems and so forth. So it can be a bit more on the technical side. But here we want to offer content that is, more accessible and digestible, even as it sort of reflects all these areas of our work, which, can rather quickly become a bit more technical. You can get the book by just simply going to lincolninst.edu. I think it's still on the homepage, also available through Columbia University Press. But I would say the best way is just go to the website, lincolninst.edu. That's short for Lincoln Institute. On social media, the handle is @landpolicy. So hopefully people can find us.
And where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
I am also on the website, lincolninst.edu, and email is the same, anthony.flint@lincolninst.edu. I'm happy to hear from anyone and everyone. I'm always looking for new mayors to interview, and it's always an interesting choice to, go to a new city and learn all about it and, sort of find a rising star. And, there's the question of smaller cities versus bigger cities. We try to do a mix. So anyway, I'm totally open to suggestions and ideas about where else we should be looking.
Awesome. And make sure folks listen to the podcast as well, right?
Yes, we've been doing sort of a combination of the essays, which appear in Landlines magazine, online and in print, and also doubling for a Land Matters podcast show. And that's great because the podcast format, we can sort of pretty much run the entire interview. Whereas, for space reasons in the magazine, we do some light editing. So yes, you can also hear many of these mayors on the Land Matters podcast.
Awesome. Well, Anthony, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
This is a great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.